Stand in the library at Biltmore House long enough and someone in your tour group will eventually notice it. A carved wooden monk in the southwest corner, robed, one finger pressed to his lips. Visitors photograph the ceiling, the 24,000 books, the two-story shelves that climb toward a painted sky. Almost nobody stops for the small figure holding a shelf's worth of silence in one carved hand. He is Saint Peter the Martyr, patron of those who go looking for the truth, and, less comfortably, patron of inquisitors too. Push against the panel behind him and it swings inward. Behind it is a room that does not appear on the printed floor guide handed out at the door. It is small, dark-paneled, and it has a name almost nobody who visits ever hears. Biltmore staff call it the Den. George Vanderbilt built 250 rooms into the largest private home ever raised in America. And somewhere in the planning of all that space, he set aside one more, hidden behind a saint, that most of his own guests were never meant to find. That is the room this story starts in. Not because it is the strangest thing at Biltmore, but because it is the smallest, and smallness is usually where a house tells you the truth about what it was actually built to hold. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The official story of Biltmore's hidden doors is not a secret. Biltmore's own historians will walk you through it happily, and most of it holds up. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect, was building a working household as much as a monument, and a working household in 1895 needed its servants to move without being seen. The door behind the Renoir portraits in the breakfast room leads straight to the butler's pantry, so a footman could clear a plate without crossing a single guest's eye line. The door beside the billiard room fireplace leads to the smoking room, so the men could retire for cigars without disturbing the women still at cards. A heavy trap door cut into the marble floor of the winter garden lets staff haul potted palms up from a storage room below without dragging them through the front hall. Every one of these has a job. Every one of them was built to solve a real, practical, unglamorous problem in running a house this size. That is the wall, and it is a solid one. Most of what is hidden at Biltmore was hidden for the same reason a modern kitchen has a door the diners never walk through. But the Den does not fit that pattern, and neither do a few other things tucked into the same building, and that is the crack worth widening. The Den was never a servant's route. It doesn't connect to a pantry or a stairwell used by staff. It connects to nothing except the library itself, through one door, guarded by a saint carved specifically to be missed. Some accounts describe it as Vanderbilt's private office, the place he handled correspondence and estate business away from guests. Other accounts, written by people who have stood in the same room, describe it instead as a quiet reading nook, a place to escape the formality of a two-story library, built to impress rather than to be lived in. Both descriptions get repeated by people who know the house well, and they cannot both be the full picture, because an office and a reading nook are not the same room built for the same reason. Nobody has produced a note in Vanderbilt's own hand explaining which one it actually was. He died in 1914, at 51, following complications from an operation, before Biltmore had settled into old age, the way it has now, and whatever he might have said about that room went with him. Now look at what sits around the Den, still inside the library, still behind the same wall of shelves. Built into the paneling near the Den are a series of small secret compartments and panels, cut into the woodwork with the same care as the visible bookcases. They are empty today. Nobody currently working at Biltmore claims certainty about what they originally held. The most common guess, offered carefully rather than confidently by people who study the house, is that they were meant for papers, maps, or building plans, the kind of documents a man overseeing an 8,000-acre construction project might want close at hand and out of sight. It is a reasonable guess. It is still a guess. A house this exhaustively documented, with surviving furniture drawings held today by the American Institute of Architects, has never produced a single inventory of what those particular compartments were built to contain. The library itself has a second hidden door too, and it is worth noting precisely because it fits the ordinary explanation so cleanly, which makes the Den's exclusion from that same logic stand out even more. Behind a tapestry hung over the fireplace on the library's upper balcony, a second concealed door opens onto a passage connecting straight to the guest bedrooms on the second floor. That door makes perfect sense inside the servant and guest logic of the house. It let visitors slip down from their rooms in nightclothes, pull a book from the shelves, and slip back without ever crossing a hallway meant for company. Even Vanderbilt's own bedroom carries a hidden closet door, built flush into the wall paneling for no reason beyond keeping the room's symmetry intact, since a normal door frame would have broken the visual balance Hunt had designed into the space. Every one of these fits neatly inside the wall. The den, standing a few dozen feet away behind its carved monk, simply does not. This is the part of the story where I want to be honest about what we actually know and what we don't, because that line matters more here than almost anywhere else in this kind of story. Biltmore is not a lost ruin. It is one of the most thoroughly documented private homes in American history, with architectural drawings, personal libraries, staff records, and construction photographs still sitting in accessible archives. That level of documentation is exactly why the gaps stand out as sharply as they do. When something goes unexplained at a 5,000-year-old temple, that is expected. When something goes unexplained inside a house, with this much paperwork behind it, in a room its own owner used every day, that gap was made on purpose, by someone, for a reason nobody wrote down. To understand why that gap matters, you have to understand the scale of the house it sits inside. George Washington Vanderbilt II was 26 years old when he began buying land outside Asheville, North Carolina, in 1888. He was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the shipping and railroad magnate whose fortune had already reshaped American industry twice over, and George used his share of it to do something almost nobody in his family had done before. He built for solitude rather than spectacle, or at least that is what he told people. He hired Hunt, already the most sought-after architect in the country, and Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who had designed Central Park, to shape both the house and the 8,000 acres around it. Construction ran from 1889 to 1895 and required its own railroad spur just to move stone and lumber into a valley that had none of the infrastructure a project this size would normally demand. When it opened on Christmas Eve of 1895, Biltmore House measured roughly 175,000 square feet across 4 floors and a basement, with 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, and a library built to hold a book collection that would eventually reach 24,000 volumes in 8 languages. It remains the largest privately built home in the United States, and it has never been surpassed. A house of that size does not hide small things by accident. Every hidden door at Biltmore was a decision, made by an architect working directly with an owner who read, by his own account, something close to 80 books a year, and clearly cared about where and how he was allowed to be alone. That context is what makes the den worth pausing on. In a house engineered down to the doorknob for privacy on a staff level, Vanderbilt still built himself one more layer of privacy that had nothing to do with staff at all. It was privacy from his own guests, inside his own library, marked by a saint whose entire symbolic purpose was silence. The Winter Garden trapdoor deserves a second look too, not because its function is mysterious, but because of what it opens onto. Beneath that marble floor sits the beginning of a sub-basement that runs under a significant portion of the house, built to hold the actual machinery of a Gilded Age mansion trying to function like a self-contained small town. The dynamo room down there once held the equipment that gave Biltmore electricity in 1895, only 6 years after Edison's first commercial power station had gone online in New York. George Vanderbilt knew Edison personally, and when Hunt wired the house, he built it to run on both direct current and alternating current, because in 1895 the entire country had not yet decided which one was going to win. Vanderbilt was not just building a home, he was hedging a bet on the future of electricity itself, inside the walls of his own basement, years before that bet was publicly settled. Past the dynamo room sits a refrigeration room that once ran on an ammonia gas and brine system to manufacture ice on site, a water supply room built around a heavy cast-iron heater still stamped with its original Tabasco brand name, and a boiler system that kept a building this size heated through Appalachian winters that regularly bury the surrounding mountains in snow. The sub-basement is, by simple square footage, one of the largest basements ever built beneath a private residence in this country, and most of it was never meant to be seen by anyone Vanderbilt considered a guest. Almost none of the general public tour touches this level. Seeing it requires a specialty ticket, guided by staff, into spaces that were built to be functional, rather than photographed, and were never designed with a visitor in mind at all. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. There is one part of this house where an actual mystery, once real, has already been solved, and it is worth walking through, because it shows exactly how these gaps get closed when someone finally looks hard enough. Deep in the basement, in a cavernous brick storage room, the walls are covered floor to ceiling in murals. Witches, bats, black cats, a platoon of wooden toy soldiers, folkloric figures out of Eastern European fairy tale. For close to a century, the room was known simply as the Halloween Room, and the story attached to it, repeated by generations of tour guides and even by members of the Vanderbilt and Cecil family themselves, was that it had been decorated for a 1920s Halloween party thrown by Cornelia Vanderbilt and her husband John Cecil, who inherited the estate after George Vanderbilt's death. Nobody could say more than that. The murals sat there, strange and slightly unsettling against the rest of the house's restrained European elegance, unexplained for generations. Then, in research beginning around 2012 and continuing through the following years, Biltmore's own museum services team found the actual answer, and it wasn't Halloween at all. Working through estate records, curator Leslie Klingner and later curator Megan Forrest traced the murals to an avant-garde Russian cabaret troupe called La Chauve-souris, French for the bat, which had toured America to enormous acclaim in the 1920s, appearing on Broadway in both 1922 and 1925. Its stage sets, designed by Russian artists Sergei Sudeikin and Nikolai Remisov, were the direct visual source for what ended up painted on Biltmore's basement walls. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely place. A memoir written by a local Asheville resident named James G.K. McClure, who described attending a bohemian-themed New Year's Eve ball at Biltmore on December 30th, 1925, complete with cauldrons, firelight, and a full room of gypsy costume, all thrown by John and Cornelia Cecil, in tribute to the cabaret they clearly loved. The Charleston Daily Mail had even reported on the party at the time, noting roughly 100 guests in attendance. The room had never been about Halloween at all. It had been decorated, once, for a single wild night ushering in 1926, and then simply never repainted. That story matters here for a specific reason. It proves that Biltmore's genuine gaps are not permanently sealed. Given the right archive, the right memoir, the right person willing to spend years chasing a thread, even a century-old mystery inside this house can be closed completely. The murals were solved. The den has not been. The compartments in the library have not been. And that difference is not because those questions are unanswerable in principle. It is because nobody has yet found the piece of paper, letter, or account that closes them, the way McClure's memoir closed the Halloween Room. The house extends well past its own walls, and that scale is part of the same picture. At its height, George Vanderbilt's estate covered roughly 125,000 acres, most of which he eventually sold to the federal government, land that became the founding core of Pisgah National Forest. He had brought in Gifford Pinchot, who would go on to lead the U.S. Forest Service, to manage the land using scientific forestry methods barely practiced anywhere else in the country at the time. 3 miles from the main house, in what is now called Antler Hill Village, a genuine underground tunnel still survives, built originally as part of the estate's working dairy operation. It is functional, explainable, and entirely disconnected from the house's own tunnel and passage network. Vanderbilt was not building one house. He was building an entire self-sufficient landscape, with its own farm, its own forestry program, its own power system, and its own logic for what stayed visible and what didn't. A hidden door in a library and a hidden tunnel 3 miles away were not separate impulses. They came from the same mind organizing the same kind of space, at every scale he could reach. Put all of it in the same room, and a pattern starts to hold together. carefully, the way it should. Biltmore was never one house with one set of rules for movement through it. It was at least 3 overlapping architectures built into the same walls. One version of the house existed for guests, full of grand staircases and formal entrances meant to be seen and admired. A second version existed for staff, a web of doors and passages engineered so that 80 or more employees could keep the first version running without ever being noticed doing it. And a third version, smaller and far less documented than the other two, existed only for George Vanderbilt himself. The den sits inside that third layer, so most likely do the empty compartments beside it. That is not a wild claim. It is the plainest reading of a house whose owner spent a fortune engineering privacy at every level except, it seems, the one closest to himself, which he built anyway, and simply never explained. It helps to remember that Vanderbilt did not build this house as an old man protecting a lifetime of accumulated secrets. He was 26 when he bought the land, and 33 when the doors opened. Whatever the den and its neighboring compartments were built to hold, they were planned by a young man deliberately carving out one room inside a 2-story library he had already filled with everything a person could want to read, that answered to no one and needed no explanation to his architect beyond the request itself. Hunt did not question it. He built it exactly as asked, hid it exactly as asked, and moved on to the next fireplace. What that third layer actually held, in daily use, during the 19 years Vanderbilt lived in this house before his death, is the part that stays out of reach. The compartments were empty by the time anyone thought to ask what belonged in them. No inventory, no letter, no staff account has surfaced describing what the den was used for on an ordinary Tuesday in, say, 1902. The specialty tours that reach the dynamo room and the deepest parts of the sub-basement still only cover a portion of what exists below the visible floors, and much of what's down there was built to be used, not remembered. Biltmore is not withholding these answers. Nobody is guarding a vault. The house is simply large enough and quiet enough about its own owner's private habits that some rooms closed one night in the early 20th century and never fully reopened, not because anyone locked them, but because the one man who could have explained them stopped being there to ask. Tour guides at Biltmore will tell you, honestly and without embellishment, that they don't know either. Ask about the den's exact original use, and you'll get the same 2 competing answers this story opened with: office or reading nook, offered with a shrug that has nothing performative about it. That shrug is rare in a house this well catalogued, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before the tour moves on to the next room. The saint is still carved into that library panel, finger still pressed to his lips, exactly where Hunt placed him more than a century ago. Visitors still walk past him by the thousands every week, most never noticing the door at all. Somewhere behind that panel is a room whose true purpose was solved once already by a costume party nobody could quite explain, until someone finally found the letter that explained it. The den is still waiting on its own version of that letter. It may already be sitting in an archive somewhere, unread, the way McClure's memoir sat for decades before anyone connected it to a basement full of painted bats. Or it may never surface at all, and the room will stay exactly what it has been for over 100 years, a small, dark, deliberately built silence at the center of the largest house in America. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.